Let's open in our Bibles to continue our study of James by opening to Hebrews. Now, isn't that interesting? That should get your attention. Hebrews chapter 11. We're looking this morning as we continue through the book of James at the attitude that these first century Christians had that made them so powerful. And I think that in order to understand the words of James, we have to see the background of Hebrews chapter 11, and specifically verse 10. And the writer of Hebrews is eloquently writing about the reality of something that those first century saints possessed. And that was that those first century saints knew that devotion to God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit issued forth into a life of sacrifice. Now look at Hebrews 11:10. It describes the great heroes of the faith, both from long ago and then of recent days in the first century. And it says in Hebrews 11:10, "For he waited for the city," talking about Abraham, "which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Now, slip down to verse 13 of Hebrews 11. "These all died in faith, not having received the promises." Now, for a minute, think about it. The promises of endless life, of endless joy, the promises of God wiping away all tears. They had a lot of promises, but they didn't ever get them in this lifetime. I mean, these people, as it says here, were hounded, stoned, sawn asunder. They were imprisoned. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Doesn't sound very good, but continuing in verse 13. They didn't receive the promises, but look at what it says in verse 13. "But having seen them afar off, they were assured of them. They embraced them. They confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." Verse 14, "For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland." Verse 15, "And truly if they had called to mind that country from which they had come, they would have had opportunity to return." They could have gone back. They could have left the affliction and tormenting, the destitution, all that stuff. They could have just kind of blended into the world. But verse 16 says, "But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." These first century church members that we're looking at in our study of James knew that devotion to Christ means sacrifice. They saw it in the history of the people that went behind them. They saw it in the recent history of the apostles that brought the gospel to them. And they saw it in their very own lives as they suffered persecution. And the eloquence of the writer of Hebrews is so evident, as he said in this passage we read this morning, that those who walk by faith do so in lifelong sacrifice. Well, what drives God's servants to make sacrifices like this? And I could read all of Hebrews chapter 11. They dwelt in tents, and they were in all this deprivation. What motivates them to make such sacrifice? Devotion to Christ. And when you're devoted to Christ, it issues forth into sacrificial living, sacrifice. Let me take you back a few centuries from us, but after the events of the first century. In 1555, the English bishop and reformer and martyr Hugh Latimer, by the way, we just 3 weeks ago were parked in a traffic jam in Oxford, England, as I was trying to get my head out the window as Jim Kessler was driving, because I was trying to get a picture of this monument, and there was such a traffic jam. If you've ever been in those, they drive on the wrong side of the road, or we do, somebody does, but we were definitely mixed up there. And I was trying to get a picture of this monument that's right in the center of town. I mean, it's surrounded by hot dogs, trucks, and it's surrounded by people that are selling postcards, but right in the middle of all that is this gigantic monument, which is set over the spot where the fellow I'm going to read to you about was burned to death on a wooden stake. And that was just 400 years ago. People were being burnt to death for their faith in Christ in England and other places. But listen to him. Hugh Latimer knew that devotion to Christ means sacrifice. Latimer was sentenced to be burned at the stake because he held a pro-Reformation position. What was the Reformation position? Sola gratia, totally by the grace of God. Sole fide, totally by faith. Sola scriptura, which means solely through or only through the scriptures we find life in Christ. It's not through human works. It's not through human achievement. It's not through the church. It's by Christ. He believed those simple truths that we believe, And prior to his death, his convictions were set forth in an open letter he wrote to what he entitled All Genuine Believers in Jesus Christ. And let me read to you from his letter. He wrote this as he was in his prison cell before they were taking him out and tying a chain around him and burning him to death, where that marker is today in Oxford, England. Beautiful words. This is what he wrote. Die once we must. How and where we know not. Here is not our home. Let us therefore accordingly consider things, having always before our eyes the heavenly city, and the way thereto in persecution. Did you catch that? He said, we're going to have to die anyway. Why not die with our eyes on the heavenly city and not turn back? Devotion to Christ. Devotion to Christ demands sacrifice. Latimer was executed, and in 1555, with his dear friend and colleague Nicholas Ridley, and as the flames were being lit, they marched them up there. It was quite a big ceremony. They wore a special outfit, and which showed they were, really outcasts of the church, and they would put devils on their outfits to show that they were going straight to hell, according to the Roman church. And they would go up with this hood over their head, and they would be marched up in chains, and then they would have to back up to this big telephone pole, and then they'd wrap the humongous chain around them to hold them against the telephone pole. And as he was up there, the people crowded in. This was a real spectacle. People enjoyed watching this. As the flames were being lit, an amazingly composed Latimer turned to his fellow martyr, Nicholas Ridley, and said this, and this is in history books because it really struck the people. He said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley. Play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." You know what happened? The tide turned. The Reformation took. England became a bastion of Christianity and of evangelical Christianity. And to this day, if you ever go on one of HMS, Her Majesty's Service ships, any of the Royal Navy, if you looked at the rope and held it sideways, in the center of every rope on every ship in the British Navy is a red thread. Do you know why? Because Her Majesty said, I want every seafaring man to remember that it's only the red crimson blood of Christ that cleanses from unrighteousness. And I want those men, and I want every ship, and I want every rope on every ship to remind them of the blood of Christ because of these men's sacrifice. What drives God's servants to make such sacrifice? Devotion to Christ. And devotion sacrifices. So the first century church people, they knew about sacrifice, and they knew devotion to Christ sacrifices. 16th century reformers knew that devotion to Christ cost something, and if you are devoted to Christ, you'll sacrifice. Let's come to near the present. In the 19th century, a little-known fellow that's every book about him is worth its weight in gold. His name is John Paton, P-A-T-O-N, knew that devotion to Christ meant sacrifice. He accepted an immense challenge while he was a student at a Bible college in London. At that time, God called him to go to the cannibal-infested New Hebrides Islands down in the South Pacific. That would be a hard thing for a young Bible college student to say yes to. I was thinking about it, and if I would have been there, I would have said, who, me? Why, I'm going to graduate. Why don't you pick one of those people that's failing? They're just going to get eaten up, and then they would be famous. Even though they'd be a failure in the ministry, they could be famous as a martyr. I don't want to go. I've got a family. And I'm sure all that went through his mind. But instead of worrying about being someone's lunch after the effort he put in school, John Paton didn't argue with God. The Lord said, go, so he went, and his wife went. A ship left them off far from shore, and they rowed to the New Hebrides in a small boat to an island inhabited by cannibals whose language they didn't even speak. Now, some of us won't even go into parts of this town because it's too dangerous. This man went with his wife in a rowboat to an island where everyone was man-eating cannibal, where all of them spoke a language they didn't know. And he didn't take a gun, and he didn't take, a SWAT team with him, and he didn't take an electrified security system. He went to that island because simply and only God called him to go. The book is, you can't put it down, it's so good. But from the moment they set up their little hut on the beach, the Lord miraculously preserved them. Many months later, when the chief of the tribe in that area was converted to Christ, this head-hunting cannibal, he asked John Paton where the army went that had surrounded his army every night, or his hut every night. He said, we came many times to get you. And every time we came, he said, you had an entire army of British troops encircling your hut. He said, where did you keep them during the day? He said, at night they were there, standing guard. And John Payton said, God's holy angels had stood guard around my hut. After he was there only a few weeks, though, his wife gave birth to their baby. And both his wife and the baby died in childbirth. All alone on the New Hebrides, he was forced to sleep on the graves of his wife and infant child to keep the cannibals from digging up the bodies and eating them. In spite of the great challenge that he faced, he decided to stay. Why? Listen to his reasoning. This is what he wrote. The adversaries were many, but that's where God wanted me. That's where God wanted me. And what drives God's servants to make such sacrifices? Devotion to Christ alone. And devotion to Christ sacrifices. Have you ever sat back and pondered how God has used people through the centuries? Have you ever seen the common thread that's in all their lives? Every one of them you can connect together, kind of like children's games of connecting the dots. There's a common element that connects all the people whose lives God has used through the centuries. And that common thread, the common denominator, the common line that you can draw between all of them is that when God asked them to do something, they were willing to do it, knowing full well that it would cost them great sacrifice. Devotion to God led them to sacrifice for God. Let me just give you, as we head back toward the New Testament, a litany of those who sacrificed. Enoch, in Genesis 5, had to go against the entire flow of culture around him to walk with God. Everybody else was walking with the world. Enoch walked with God, and he walked alone with God. Now, some of you might think you're all alone, but you're not. Look at, there are a few hundred people around you, and there are many more, thousands and millions around the planet. But as far as we know, when Enoch was walking with God, he might have been the only one on the planet. And every imagination of their hearts was only evil continually. You think you have peer pressure. How would you like to have everyone against you? And when you walk with God, you were looking. It's kind of like walking in the elevator. I like to do this. It's kind of one of my habits. I like to get on the elevator, and everyone's facing the door, and I stand like this and face them and smile at them. And, you know, people will go, what's wrong with you? You know, they're all looking at someone's back of their head, and I'll look at them and smile. But, you know, that's because I want to remind myself that most of us in this world are going against the stream and against the flow. Enoch was. Noah, he had to sacrifice his everyday way of life if he was going to devote himself to God. God says, I want you to build a boat. He had to give up his ranching or whatever he was doing and build a boat for over 100 years. How about Abraham? God says, hey, I want you to give up your culture. I want you to give up your comfort. I want to give up you to give to me the control over your life. All that if you want to become the father of God's chosen people. That's Genesis 12, verses 1 through 8. And you know what Abraham said? Yes. I'll go, I'll do, I'll give up, I'll leave behind. I'll follow you, I'll dwell in tents. I will wait endlessly, if necessary, for this son of promise. How about Moses? Moses had to leave the comforts of Pharaoh's court in order to stand for God. Later, he had to get out of his comfortable obscurity in Midian on the backside of the desert to stand for God. That's Exodus 3. But every time God said, leave your comfort zone, leave the area that you like, God's servants, if you trace the line between all of them, are willing to sacrifice. David couldn't keep the simple life of a shepherd boy and still be God's king for Israel in 1 Samuel 16, verses 1 through 3. He had to give it up. He had to sacrifice to serve God. Elisha had to leave his oxen, which was basically the sign of his business. He had to leave all of the family behind and all the security attached to it to go for God as a prophet in 1 Kings 19:16. And Elisha sacrificed it all to serve God. And then we could go through many more, but the last one I have is Daniel. Daniel had to leave the crowd who were his own Israelite peers. I mean, the crowd of God's people wasn't even going God's way. And Daniel had to leave the crowd and turn from his own peers and even had to give up his job security in order to become God's man for the era in which he lived. And that's the first 6 chapters of Daniel. And he gave up the potential for royal service. He gave up the potential of making and winning friends and influencing people for God. And so what did God do with him? After he turned his back on all them and risked everything, God put all... I mean, do you ever hear about the rest of those Hebrew captives other than the ones that stood up for God? No. But you hear about Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. Why? Because they were willing to stand for God. And devotion to Christ involves sacrifice. Always has, always will. And what drives these and all of God's servants to make sacrifice? Devotion to Christ. And when you are devoted to Christ, you're willing to sacrifice comfort, time, security, even family, as John Payton did in New Hebrides. Well, turn to Matthew with me. We're going to take a few snapshots on our way through the New Testament to the book of Acts. And Matthew chapter 2, in verse 11. And I just want to show you some sacrifices of devotion in the Gospels. Those were some portraits from the Old Testament, those 7 I mentioned. But in the New Testament, we have the same idea, sacrifices of devotion. And the first one is the wise men sacrificed to worship Jesus. Look at Matthew 2:11. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down. It's interesting. You want to study something interesting. Look at the positions of worship. Falling down is regular. All the way through the book of Revelation, they must have had knee pads on because they're always falling down. They're falling on their knees. They're falling on their faces. They're laying down because they so want to show God that he is everything, and they don't want to get any of the attention, so they kind of drop out of sight and fall down. And these wise men fell down, worshipped him, and after they worshipped him and humbled themselves, they opened their treasures and they presented gifts to him: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They came to see Jesus. At what cost? Well, probably they traveled over a year from way off in the far reaches of the Medo-Persian Empire, maybe toward India. And you know, travel is very difficult across that part of land. I mean, regularly we let people off the tour bus when we're over there doing a Bible study conference in Israel, and we let them walk around out in the desert. And you know what? People, after a few minutes, they kind of get right back up to the vehicle. They don't like to be away from it because it's so desolate. It's so quiet. You don't hear anything except your own breathing. It's very quiet out there, and it's kind of overpowering. And these men subjected themselves to a year of travel at that great cost, and they traveled, and what did they do? They came from afar, and they fell before Jesus, and they offered their treasures to him. They wisely sacrificed to worship Christ. And it doesn't stop there. Look at chapter 4 of Matthew's Gospel. I'll show you another one. The disciples, the first disciples, like the wise men, also sacrificed to follow Jesus. Those first followers left behind their security to follow Christ. Matthew 4:22. When Jesus called, look what happened. And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. They left the boat, source of security and income, and their father, source of, all the security that would provide. They left that behind to follow Jesus. The first disciples sacrificed to follow Jesus. Look at chapter 6 of Matthew, a little bit further. Jesus' first sermon. What does he preach about? Sacrifice. Sacrifice. He said, if you want to invest with me, you've got to exchange your earthly treasures for ones in heaven. You've got to give them up. He says you can't have both. He says you can't hold on to it here and get it there. He says you got to let go here in order to have it there. I can remember my first experience. As a young man, I got my credit card. Back in the 70s, that was a big deal. And I remember getting my credit card out, and I went, and you had to stand behind the glass, and it has that little tray that goes underneath, and the person going, how are you doing? You can't quite hear that microphone they have at the gas station. And I remember I had my credit card, and I stood there, and they went like that. And I thought, I'm not going to turn loose this thing. My mom told me, don't let anybody have it, And so there I'm standing, they go, come on, put that in the thing. And I said, what? And they said, put it in the thing. And so I set it down there, and they grabbed it, and they were behind the glass, and they had my credit card. It's hard to turn loose it, but I found out to get the benefit of it, you had to let go of it so they could do whatever they did with it and charge me. By the way, they punched one too many buttons and charged me $600 for my gas instead of $6. And they said, but it's automatic, and we'll just issue you a $594 credit. I knew I should have done what Mom said, not giving them that credit card. But you know what? You had to let loose of it for the benefit. And look what Jesus says. You have to let loose of it. Matthew 6, 19 and 20. Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Why, Jesus? Because moths will destroy it. Now, what you say, wait a minute, we have mothballs. Well, back then, they didn't. They had wormwood. Wormwood is a bush that grows. It's an herb. And if you cut your wormwood bush off, I grow wormwood. It's a nice herb. And if you turn it upside down and hang it in your closet, it's supposed to ward off moths. The problem is it falls apart and gets all over, you know. It's kind of not real efficient. But even with wormwood back then, moths still came in and ate their silk and their precious garments. And rust destroyed. And thieves broke in and stole. He says, why would you ever put your treasures somewhere where they can get wet and moldy and rusted and have people steal them when you can lay up your treasures in heaven where, he says, we don't have any moths up there. We don't have rust. There's no mildew. There's no flood. There's no storms. And there are no thieves allowed to break in and steal. And Jesus said, if you want treasures in heaven, exchange them now. Kind of like the Russians. Did you know they're changing their money? As I told you, when we went out with the Merrills, and I see Scott up there, and I paid for his dinner. He's one of those heavy eaters at the end of the table I told you about. But it cost 1,000,000 rubles. That's less than $40. And you know what Yeltsin just declared last week? He said, we're going to knock the last 3 zeros off all the money. They actually should knock the last 6 zeros off, really. But they're going to knock the last 3. And he said, you got to exchange your money. Give it to me, he said, and I'll give you the new money. It doesn't sound very good to me, But he said, if you want your money to be worth anything, you got to trade it in, the new Russian ruble. Jesus says, hey, I'm not going to trick you. I'm not trying to get your money. He said, what I'm trying to get is your devotion, and devotion will sacrifice. Keep turning to Matthew 26. I want to show you another one. Matthew 26, and the New Testament's filled. I'm just drawing a few lines here between some points in the Bible just to give you an idea. But Matthew 26:6, the end of Christ's ministry was anointed with sacrifice. And this is so beautiful. When Jesus was in Bethany, verse 6, at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head. Now, for you to get the idea, some of these vials are still there. In fact, in the burnt house, it's called, in Jerusalem, they have a place that made this expensive perfume, and it was destroyed in the destruction in AD 70. And when the house burned, the roof fell in, and it sealed everything, so all the perfume bottles didn't get broken or stolen by the Romans, and they're all still there. And it's very interesting to see them. They're exquisite, delicate vials, and they would seal them with the perfume inside so it wouldn't evaporate or lose its beautiful fragrance. And if you wanted to use the perfume, instead of having a nice cork or a nice screw top, you had to break off the top and pour it out, and it was gone. You didn't get to put it back together. And so this woman broke her vial of very costly perfume, and since she couldn't keep it, it was just filling the room, she dumped it on Christ. She lavished it on him. That's a beautiful hymn, broken and poured out in devotion to Christ as he reclined at the table. And to those who weren't worshiping, verse 8, they says, wow, this is waste. But Jesus said, hey, verse 10, she's done a great thing. She anointed me with sacrifice. Jesus likes no regret sacrifices. He likes people that break their vial and dump it on him and don't say, oh, wish I could have kept half of that. When they do that, what does he do? Ananias and Sapphira. Boom. Because don't give the appearance of sacrificing and then hold back. Don't give the appearance of saying, all to Jesus I give, and then on the side hold back. Jesus doesn't like that. He likes no regret sacrifices. One more, Mark 12. Turn over the next book. Mark's Gospel, the next Gospel, chapter 12. Because this is what Jesus says. He says, I measure an offering given to me in Mark 12:43 by the sacrifice that's involved in giving it. He says, most people measure by the weight, or they measure by the volume. Jesus said, I don't. He says, with me, I measure by how much it cost you to give that. Now, have you ever thought about that? That's the only equitable way. For some people, $1 is a big thing. I was sharing Tuesday night. I was at this dinner with 3 other couples, and they had us all tell how we met our wife. And so it was really neat to hear. Some of them I'd never heard how they met their wife and how the Lord led them. So I was sharing, and I said, on our second date, I was so impoverished when I met Bonnie. Now I'm more impoverished with all the children. But when I met her, I only had $1 for our first date. So we went to Dunkin' Donuts and bought 1 cup of coffee and 1 donut, and we got 1 free cup of hot water with a lemon. And I squeezed the lemon and gave that to her, and I took the coffee. And we split the donut in half for $1. And we had 10 cents left over to leave on the counter. You know, $1 then was a lot. Now, $1 now might not be very much. But did you know that was giving her everything? That was my laundry money. I had to wear everything twice that week, I didn't wash it and didn't go out with her either, because of that. And that was a sacrifice too. But look at Mark chapter 12, verse 43. Jesus called his disciples and said, look at that poor widow. You all know the story. It's the widow's mite, and she had 2 little leptons, they're called. And they're so small that they could fit on your thumb, and you could cover them with your finger, and no one could see them. They were called onion skins back then. They were so tiny. They were worthless to most people. This is everything she had. She had 2 little coins that were stuck on her finger, and she had to hold them so she wouldn't lose them. And Jesus says, watch her. Assuredly, I say, this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury, for they all put in out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had, her whole livelihood. Jesus said offerings in heaven are measured by the sacrifice that are involved. And Jesus said, I like no regret sacrifice. I don't like you to calculate how it can hurt the least. I want you to calculate how the sacrifice you make to me will hurt the most. Because we need to hurt the fleshly desire we have to clutch and to grasp. Well, that's the sacrifice of devotion in the Gospels. Now turn to Acts chapter 1. Let's see what happened in the early church. Jesus preached his heart out. And let's see what they caught, okay? Acts chapter 1. Real quickly, I'm just going to zip through these. Note the progression in the book of Acts, because what I like about the book of Acts is it's the application of Jesus' sermons. Jesus taught for 3.5 years. He had 12 men following him everywhere he went. One of them aborted at the end, Judas, and they kept following Jesus, and they show us in the book of Acts what they caught from what he said. Acts chapter 1, verse 4. The first thing we see is that these early Christians sacrificed their time. It says, in being assembled together with them, Jesus commanded them, don't depart from Jerusalem. Wait for the promise of the Father, which, he said, you have heard from me. Boy, that's a little open-ended, isn't it? He says, stay here and wait. You ever had someone tell you that? I remember one time my mom left me somewhere. Remember how shuttle kids all over the place to school events? I remember she told me, you stay at Wilshire. That was a school, elementary or secondary. I don't know what it was. I was a little shaver. And she says, don't go on the bus. You wait for me. I'm going to pick you up at school. So I went out and told the bus person, nope, I'm not getting on the bus. My mom told me to wait here. They said, are you sure, Johnny? I said, I'm sure. So I'd never been bad up to that point, so they thought maybe I was telling the truth. So the bus, I remember seeing big cloud of smoke. They all left. Pretty soon the teachers started leaving, and little Johnny Barnett was pacing in front of the school. Pretty soon the principal left. He says, Johnny, are you sure you're supposed to be here? Oh, yes, my mom said she'd pick me up. The sun was setting. I had tears. I thought the Lord came back. I was brought up in the church, and I thought for sure the rapture had occurred. My mom, here comes the little gray Falcon station wagon. And I was crying. Boy, I was never happier to see that old car in my life. But I still remember the sun was going down in the trees, and when that car came, and I remember my mom said, the car didn't start. And don't worry, I knew you'd be here. And I still remember I was standing there crying, but I waited. You know what? Jesus said, wait. Don't leave Jerusalem. And it was 10 days, we know from chronology. And they had to hang around for 10 days. And they sacrificed their time. They didn't go to work. They didn't go off to scheduled vacations. They didn't go to family events. They waited on the Lord. And you know, that's a missing element nowadays. Few people know how to wait on God for His blessing. But look at the next one in chapter 2, verse 7. Not only did they sacrifice their time, in 2:7, they sacrificed their normal conversations. I like to put it this way. They gave their mouth to Jesus. You know, a lot of people want to give themselves to Jesus. They just never give their mouth to Him. You wouldn't know from their conversation that they even belonged to Him. But these gave their mouth to Jesus, and they were all amazed and marveled and said to one another, "Look, aren't these who speak Galileans?" What were they doing? They were speaking for Christ. They gave their mouth to Jesus. They sacrificed their normal conversations to speak for Him. Look at verse 45, chapter 2. They sacrificed their possessions. They sold their possessions in good and divided among them as anyone that had need. They gave up stuff that they had, stuff that was important to them. It had to be good because they could sell it, and so it was good stuff. And they sold it for Jesus. They sacrificed their possessions. Look at 4:32. Chapter 4, verse 32. They also sacrificed their right of personal ownership. It says in 4:32, "Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul, and they didn't have anyone that said that anything that they owned was theirs." They had everything in common. What does that mean? A commune? No. What it means is, all I have, all I am, all I'll ever be, absolutely, positively, now and forever, I give all, what? To Thee. See, they had settled the personal ownership deal. And they said, we give everything to You. And how do You want to use it, God? It's all Yours. My time, my mouth, my money, it's Yours. How do You want to use it? See, it's a lot of fun. When I was a salesman back in the 80s, going to seminary, I used to work for a mega. Remember how money flew in the 80s? It flew out of here in the 80s, I think, in the bus. But I remember the corporations, they couldn't spend enough on stuff. And in the 80s, as a college kid working for a company, I had an $800 a week expense account for hotels and meals. Boy, it was fun. I mean, I went to different Japanese hibachi places every night. Do you remember those days? Didn't matter. As long as the sales were up, you could spend anything. I would try and stay in the highest buildings. I loved staying in those high-rise hotels. That's before the hotel fires, you know. And I used to love to eat in the place and stay up there. And, boy, for a college kid, it was fun. You know what? It was easy to spend the money because it wasn't mine. Most of us have trouble investing in God because we consider it ours. It's easy to spend it when it belongs to someone else. And God says, these people, He says, they gave up their personal right of ownership. Now, how'd they do that? Last verse, look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 5. And they are in this, not as we expected, but first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. How did that first century church, how did they do that? How did they get people to talk about Jesus? How did they get people to wait around for Jesus? How did they get people to sell their stuff for Him? How did they get people to give up their ownership and say that no longer are all these things mine, but yours? Well, right here is the secret in verse 5. They first gave themselves to the Lord. What drives God's servants to make such sacrifices? Devotion to Christ and devotion sacrifices. I wonder, have you ever done that? Have you ever given yourself to Jesus first? I know we've been singing it all month, and we sang it months ago. But have you ever done that? Have you ever said, Lord, my life, my possessions, my family, my children's future, my future, I give all to You? One person who said that they gave all to Christ meant it, and his name was David Livingstone. He was a pioneering missionary to Africa. He wrote his prayer before he left. I'll read to you his prayer. It's beautiful. Someone made this a song. It's hard not to sing it as I read the words. O Lord, since Thou hast died, Livingstone said, to give Thyself for me, no sacrifice would seem too great for me to make for Thee. I only have one life, and that will soon be past. I want my life to count for Christ. What's done for Him will last. I follow Thee, my Lord, and glory in Thy cross. I gladly leave the world behind and count all gain as loss. Lord, send me anywhere. Only go with me. Lay any burden on me. Only sustain me. Sever any tie, save the tie that binds me to Thy heart.
Lord Jesus, my King, I consecrate my life, Lord, to Thee. What did that mean for him? It meant he lived in a tent, on a cot, in the rainforests of Africa, ministering to souls the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when he got so feverish and so sick, and he finally died on his cot in the rainforest of Central Africa, he asked them before he died to cut his heart out and carry it by porter to have it buried at Westminster Abbey, because his heart was in his homeland that sent him with the gospel. But he said, I want my body buried with my people. How does the sacrifice of devotion apply to us here? Well, I think a little bit different in each one of us. Some of us might need to sacrifice our time, as so many of you are, but as our church grows, we need more and more and more of us to do that. It should be that there are always people standing in line to work with the children, to work with the facilities, to work in all the ministries, and that's how it is. But as we grow, there's need for more people to sacrifice their time for Jesus. All of us need to sacrifice our mouth and give our mouth to Jesus and start talking to Him. And as I've told you many times, you need to, on the way out today, grab a tract and try and give it out this week and talk to someone about Jesus. We give you the opportunity and the method and the means to do that. All you have to do is sacrifice your voice for the Lord's glory. But there's another way, and I want to read this paper to you. And I would like you, after I get done reading this, to put this in your Bible and keep it there for a month. You ought to read it over. You ought to read it over every so often as you want. And think and say, God, if God's servants are devoted to Christ and they sacrifice, how do you want me to sacrifice? Let me just read you these words, and then we're going to celebrate together. How does the sacrifice of devotion apply to us here at Tulsa Bible Church? Well, number one, we should want to see God provide exceedingly above all that we, His people, could comprehend. As Exodus 36, verse 5 says, the people are bringing more than enough. It should be in everything, from ushers, greeters, Sunday school teachers, nursery workers, right down the line to ministry heads, to people going out in evangelism. It should be that in every department we have more than we could possibly comprehend. Secondly, we should be able to say, I want to give Jesus something that truly costs me dearly to let it go. David said this, I will not sacrifice, right in the middle of that verse, to the Lord my God, burnt offerings. Burnt. He burned them. That means once you offered it, you didn't get anything back. You didn't give $10 and get a nice book in the mail. You just gave $10. You burnt it. It was given up totally. It was a total sacrifice to the Lord. I'll not sacrifice, Lord my God, burnt offerings that cost me nothing. And I was sharing with the elders, I said, most of us give out of our abundance. And I know that many give out of great sacrifice. But most of us, we calculate how we can give something that won't impede our goals. And I was telling the elders, I said, if you want to get real specific, one thing that really is a deep-seated thing with me, I always love to pay a little bit more than the mortgage payment is. I mean, it would kill me if I couldn't write 50 cents extra. I mean, I want to give more because I don't like that interest on the mortgage. And I said, for me, to not pay the overage would be a step back. And for you, just think in your mind, what is it that would hurt you? What would cost you something to give it? And you know what? That's what we should want to give to the Lord. Something that truly costs us, that impedes our financial goals. Thirdly, I want to sacrifice today in order to lay up my treasures where they'll never get rusted, rotted, ruined, or how about this, ripped off? That's another R. I just thought of that one. Not stolen, ripped off. We should want to put treasure somewhere where nothing will get to them. The next one, I want to show my love to the Lord Jesus by investing my dearest treasures in His precious church. Remember that woman broke her bottle and dumped it on Christ. And finally, from Revelation 3:18, I want my savings to last forever because I invested them in Jesus Christ. Jesus said, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in fire so you can become rich, and white clothes to wear so you can cover yourselves.